This always seems to happen in January. This week, I totally hit a creative wall and I had no idea what to make. What do you do when that happens? I went back to basics, an old favorite stencil, and I took it to its limits and beyond. Let me show you. I really just wanted to show you how many different things you can do with a basic geometric stencil, even if you use the same colors. And here it is, the Crafter's Workshop Illusion Stencil. And this was my first two mistakes, but I'll come back to that. Right now, I'm oblivious. I just wanted to start with the basics, blend some ink through the stencil, but even then you can add some more interest by using more than one color. I went with primaries with an overlap so I'd get some orange and purple, and then I cleaned off the edges of the stencil so that I could add some blue to the edge of the yellow and yellow to the edge of the blue to get some green as well. And here's where my mistakes started to become more apparent. I had put pixie spray on the back of the stencil to help hold it down on my cardstock. And normally you know that I love using a grip mat, but the joints in this stencil are so delicate and small, and that grip mat was sticky, plus the pixie spray was sticky, so it was all double sticky, and I broke a couple of the joints when I tried to peel it off. So first lesson for next time, I would use this stencil either in my Misty or in my Waffle Flower stencil mat with a corner, with a piece of 6-inch square cardstock so the stencil wasn't sticking to anything. Now I really love this look, but you don't have to stop here with all that white space. I went back over with the same colors in the same places to get a toned down look with less contrast. And I find that this gives it almost even more of a 3D look, and it gives another chance to create those additional colors in the overlap areas. Now, of course, there's ink on the stencil, and I like to use it as a stamp almost, by spritzing the stencil with just clean water. It gives me another panel to use another day. Plus, it helps to get a lot of the ink off the stencil. I trimmed my panel down to a square, and then I used a smaller square die to cut a piece from the center. You see me do this a lot with my dies that cut little frames. I like to leave the frame cut out to create a negative feature, but this time I went even further and I cut a circle from the square I cut. I love mixing squares and circles to get the contrast of the straight and curved lines. To finish this one, I added a black square to the opening, and then I stacked up a white die-cut sentiment from Hero Arts, and some clear gems from Crafty Meraki. And I used the leftover strip from the A2 panel to get a 2-for-1. I added it to a narrow white strip, and then I glued that onto a black panel that I had run through my die-cutting machine with the Altenew Angled Mosaics 3D embossing folder. I love the pop of color on the black, but I also think that those two geometric patterns play really well together. This one has a Simon Says stamp thanks sentiment and more of those Crafty Meraki gems. For my next look, I was still using my grip mat, and this time I wanted to combine the stencil with some masking to emphasize the squares in the illusion pattern. I looked through my stash to see if I had a square die the right size so that I could cut it from a post-it note to create a mask, but I didn't. So I created my own mask with some post-it tape. This is 2-inch tape that I cut in half with my scissors because I couldn't find my 1-inch tape. And I placed it carefully around one of the squares in the stencil design, making sure I had the straight edge of the tape around the area I wanted to blend the ink into. I blended yellow over that whole square, and then I masked the square diagonally and added red on the top portion to give me some orange. Then I carefully picked up my mask, and I figured that I better make a plan as to how I was going to do this. I started with the yellow and red, and I counted the squares and put that pattern down in the appropriate areas all over the card front. I think this is a really neat look, and you could just do a few of them, leaving the rest of the card white for another look. But I filled it all in. Then I moved to my next color combination, which was blue on the bottom with yellow on top to create the green. And I actually changed how I was doing it this time. I put the yellow down first on the top half, and then went back with the blue all over. This was to prevent my yellow brush picking up the blue ink from the stencil. And as I'm working, you can see that I'm getting a tone-on-tone look because the ink is sitting on top of the stencil. But remember, underneath, those areas are actually pure white. I did have a grand plan to go back and do that tone-on-tone like I did with the first card. I finished up with the red and blue squares, this time red all over and then blue at the top half to create the purple. And I'm loving the richness of these blends. That's one of the great things about my Catherine Pooler inks, how nicely they blend with each other to create new colors. I got to the end, and now here's the big reveal. And this time I noticed when I ripped the stencil. We'll talk more in a second. Remember, I was still planning to go back with the tone-on-tone, but I actually ended up loving all the bold contrast with the white on this one, and I decided not to. Now looking at this, I have another idea for highlighting yet another pattern in the stencil, but that's going to have to be in a future video. Once again, I used the ink on the stencil to create another panel. These soft, almost watercolor looking panels will be in my background box next time I'm looking to make some quick cards. To finish this one, I went to my stash of die-cut sentiments. I love to have extras on hand, not only so I can make quick cards, but also so I can make quick comparisons like I did here. I started with the black on white sentiment from Waffle Flower, but I was able to also try out the white on black, and I felt like that popped much better. I trimmed down my panel with a stitched rectangle die, and it cut it so deeply that the edge actually perforated and started coming away from the rest of the rectangle. So I just grabbed some clear tape, put it on the back of the main part of the rectangle, and then carefully pushed that torn edge into place, and now no one will ever know. You can see that I had cut some white dots to use as embellishments, but when I decided on the white on black sentiment, I felt like it made more sense to have more black on the card. So I cut some black dots with a Tim Holtz cover plate die, and I put the white ones away for next time. Now maybe if I'd put the panel on a black card base, I would have used the white dots. I really just go with how I feel in the moment as the card's coming together. And here's the straw that broke the camel's back. Yep, I embossed a panel with the stencil. It looks great, but I'm afraid my stencil is done for at this point. I think it's probably wiser to choose stencils that are more robust with smaller holes and bigger joint areas for embossing. In the meantime, I better make the most of this panel. I've been wanting to try using a brayer on an embossed panel to apply ink. So I got out my 2-inch brayer and I rolled it on top of each of my ink pads to apply the ink, hopefully just to the part of the cardstock that's been pushed up by that embossing. I used the same 3 colors as my other cards and that same overlap method. I did end up getting tiny bits of ink on the lower areas, which was not my plan, but at this point I had no choice but to embrace it. And in the end, I really quite liked the distressed look it gave. I decided to roll the inks in the other direction as well, almost to make a plaid, to really get all those lovely blended colors that are so rich. I was really happy with the outcome. To get another look, I reused my square masks that I had created, but this time without the diagonal division. I put down squares of yellow, then red and blue, and I overlapped them in places just to add a little more interest. Now this time I didn't have any pre-cuts of this die from Spellbinders, but I loved that it fit right into 4 squares of the pattern. But it wasn't very visible, and I was pretty sure that the white wouldn't be much more visible, so I decided to try something different. I got out my scissors and I just snipped out those 4 squares for my sentiment to nestle perfectly inside. I wasn't sure where else I was going to go with this one, and I played around for quite a while before ending up cutting the panel with a large circle die. To add some definition, I cut a partial circle from some black cardstock that was slightly bigger to give a frame on the left side and add some balance with that black sentiment on the right. My poor stencil is done for, I'm afraid, and while its demise put an end to this video before I ran out of ideas, I would say it didn't die in vain. Here's a different look you can create on a card I made previously using tone-on-tone and die cuts to create a Christmassy scene. Honestly, this stencil was $7 well spent, and I've ordered a new one because I'm not finished with it yet. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.